The dust of Salvation Creek, Montana, tasted like an ending. For Jane Vance, stepping off the train with a one-way ticket and a portrait of a man she'd never met, it was. She was a mail-order bride, a $20 stamp on a parcel of desperation. But the man who met her wasn't the simple rancher from the letters. He was a giant, a brute carved from the mountains themselves, with eyes as cold as a high plains winter. She had come prepared to give her life, but she hadn't prepared for him. The platform at Salvation Creek wasn't a platform at all. It was just a patch of ground where the earth was packed harder than the surrounding prairie. Jane Vance stepped down from the train car, her black, city-worn boots sinking an inch into the chalky dust. She tasted grit on her tongue. Her gaze swept the town, which consisted of a general store, a saloon whose bat-wing doors flapped lazily in the wind, and a livery. And then she saw him. The letters, penned in a surprisingly neat cursive, had described Silas Kincaid as a man of considerable size. This was a gross understatement. The man waiting at the end of the platform wasn't just large, he was colossal. He stood a full head taller than any other man, with shoulders that seemed to block out the sun. He wore a dusty black duster, and his hat was pulled low, casting his face in a shadow that seemed permanent. Jane's heart, which had been hammering a rhythm of pure, unadulterated fear for the entire 3-week journey from Boston, seemed to stop altogether. This was not a rancher. This was a mountain. Miss Vance? His voice was a low rumble, like stones shifting in a dry creek bed. She clutched her single carpet bag. Mr. Kincaid. Her voice came out a whisper. He nodded once, a sharp, curt movement. He didn't offer to take her bag. He simply turned. Wagons this way. The ride to the Kincaid ranch was an education in silence. Jane, who had been raised on witty conversation and intellectual debate in her father's now bankrupt Boston shipping office, tried to fill the void. The landscape is very vast, Mr. Kincaid. He grunted. Your letters mentioned you raise cattle. She finally fell silent, her humiliation a hot stone in her throat. The man in the letters had been gentle, almost poetic. He had written of the fierce beauty of the prairie and the honest solitude of a life built with one's own hands. This man, this giant, was a silent, intimidating brute. The ranch, when they arrived, was as overwhelming as its owner. The main house was a 2-story log structure, immense and dark, built to withstand a siege. It was impressive, but there was no softness to it. No curtains in the windows, no flowers by the door. Just wood, stone, and shadow. A woman with a face like sour milk and iron-grey hair, pulled into a severe bun, was waiting on the porch. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked Jane up and down with open disapproval. This is Maeve O'Malley, Silas grumbled. She sees to the house. I see, Jane said, trying to offer a smile. Maeve just sniffed. Supper's at 6. He likes it punctual. Don't be late. She turned and disappeared back into the house, the door slamming shut with a sound like a gunshot. She seems lovely, Jane murmured, her attempt at humor dying in the dry air. Silas Kincaid merely stared at her. His face was all harsh angles, a broken nose that had healed crooked, and a jawline that looked like it had been carved from granite. His eyes, now that she could see them in the fading light, were a startling, pale grey, the color of a winter sky right before a blizzard. Your room is upstairs. First door on the right. The other one is mine. At the end of the hall. He was observing the propriety of separate rooms before the wedding. It was the first decent thing he'd done. The preacher, Reverend Gideon, comes through on circuit tomorrow, he said, his voice flat. We'll be married at noon, in the parlor. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, as unchangeable as the mountains looming on the horizon. Jane nodded, unable to speak. She felt like a calf being led to a new, terrifying pen. That night, she lay in a narrow, lumpy bed, staring at the rough-hewn beams of the ceiling. The house was filled with noises, the groaning of the logs, the scraping of a branch against the glass, and the heavy, measured tread of Silas Kincaid, pacing in his room down the hall. Thud, thud, thud. It was the sound of a giant, restless and caged. She was a virgin, sheltered and educated. Her father's debts had forced her hand, forcing her to answer an advertisement for a bride. She had thought she was prepared for a hard life. She was prepared for calloused hands, simple food, and hard work. She was not prepared for this. She was not prepared for the sheer, terrifying scale of the man downstairs, the man who would be her husband in less than 24 hours. She pulled her thin nightgown tighter, shivering, and prayed for the first time that the morning would never come. The wedding was a bleak affair. Reverend Gideon was a gaunt man with a hollow cough who seemed eager to be on his way. He spoke the words from the good book in a monotone, his eyes fixed on the whiskey bottle Maeve O'Malley had pointedly not put away. Jane stood beside Silas Kincaid in the dark, wood-panelled parlour. She wore her one good dress, a dark blue wool that was too heavy for the season, but was the most respectable thing she owned. Silas wore a black suit that seemed impossibly tight, straining across his massive chest and shoulders. He smelled faintly of soap and leather. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the preacher intoned, snapping his book shut. Silas did not kiss his bride. He merely placed a thick, calloused hand on her elbow. The touch was light, almost hesitant, but it sent a jolt of pure, primal fear through her. His hand was so large it wrapped almost entirely around her upper arm. He could break her, she thought, with one casual squeeze. "Maeve," Silas said, his voice rumbling. "See the Reverend out. Give him the provisions." "Aye," the housekeeper snapped, glaring at Jane as if this were all her fault. And then they were alone. The sun was setting, casting long, menacing shadows across the parlour floor. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the ticking of a large grandfather clock in the corner. Silas turned to her. He seemed to fill the entire room. "It is done." "Yes." Her voice was a mouse squeak. He studied her for a long moment, his grey eyes unreadable. "You are my wife now, Jane. You know what that means." I do." She had been raised to be a proper lady, but she was not a fool. She knew what was expected of her on her wedding night. The thought of this man, this giant, touching her, it made her feel faint. He took a step toward her. Jane took an instinctive step back, her hands flying up to her throat. A flicker of something crossed his face. Was it anger? Or was it hurt? It vanished so quickly she couldn't be sure. "You are afraid of me," he stated. It was not an accusation. It was a fact. "You are a very large man, Mr. Kincaid," she stammered. "Silas," he corrected her. "You will call me Silas, and I am your husband." He took another step. She was now backed against the cold stone of the fireplace. She had nowhere else to run. He reached out a hand, not to strike, but to... What? Touch her face. She flinched violently. "Please!" The word hung in the air, sharp and desperate. Silas's hand froze, hovering in the space between them. His whole body went rigid. The silence stretched, becoming brittle and dangerous. "Please don't," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. She was so tired, so scared, and so utterly alone. I can't, not like this." He lowered his hand slowly. His voice, when it came, was scraped raw. "Did you think I would force you, girl?" I I don't know what to think. I've been here one day. You've barely spoken 2 words to me. You are a stranger, and you frighten me." The confession burst out of her, a sob of truth. He looked away, his gaze falling on the empty fireplace. He seemed to shrink, just for a moment, folding in on himself. "I am accustomed to that," he said softly, the words not meant for her. She saw a flicker of the man from the letters. The lonely one. A sliver of courage returned to her. "I will be your wife," she said, her voice shaking but gaining strength. "I will keep your house, and I will be your partner, as I promised in my letters. I will honor our contract. But I am asking you for time." She looked at his hands, calloused and scarred, each one the size of a small ham. She looked at his body, a wall of muscle and bone. And she looked at her own small, trembling frame. The sheer physical impossibility of it terrified her. "I am overwhelmed," she whispered, the words a raw, honest plea. "This house, this land, you, it's all so much. I need to breathe. Can you not just go slowly?" She pressed her hand against her chest, as if to calm her racing heart. "Please," she begged, the tears now tracking paths through the dust on her cheeks. Just the tip." She wasn't talking about the physical act, not entirely. She was talking about this new life. She was asking him to let her in just a little at a time, not to drown her in the full, terrifying reality of it all at once. Silas stared at her, his face a mask of stone. He seemed to be weighing her words, or perhaps weighing her. He reached out again, slowly, giving her time to pull away. He didn't touch her face. He just gently, almost reverently, brushed a tear from her cheek with the pad of his thumb. The calloused skin was surprisingly soft. "I am not a patient man, Jane," he rumbled, "but I am not a monster. Not in the ways you think." He took a heavy step back, putting space between them. The gesture was a concession, a small armistice. "You will keep your room," he said, his voice formal again. "I will remain in mine. We will go slowly." He turned his massive back to her and walked to the parlor door. "Silas!" she called out, a sudden, strange impulse. He paused, his hand on the doorframe, but did not turn. "Thank you." He said nothing. He simply left the room, his heavy footsteps echoing down the hall. Jane sank into a chair, her body shaking with relief and a new, confusing emotion. The giant had shown her mercy. But as she sat there in the dark, she heard the front door open and close, and the sound of his footsteps, heading not up the stairs, but out into the night. She was his wife, but she was still alone. And the most terrifying part was, for the first time, a small part of her wished he had stayed. The next 3 weeks passed in a strained, silent routine. Jane and Silas Kincaid lived as 2 ghosts in one very large house. They ate their meals in silence, Maeve O'Malley's presence a palpable, simmering resentment at the head of the table. Maeve was a dragon guarding a keep, and Jane was the unwelcome princess. Jane tried to make herself useful. She cleaned the already spotless house, tended to the small, dying vegetable garden behind the kitchen, and mended Silas's work shirts, her fingers marveling at the sheer size of the garments. Silas was gone from sunup to sundown. She would watch him from the kitchen window, a colossal figure on a horse that looked comically small beneath him, riding out to check his fences or move his small herd of cattle. He was a man of the earth, and he seemed to be actively avoiding the woman he had paid to bring to it. The marriage in name only held. He never approached her. He never spoke to her, unless it was a direct, necessary question. The distance he gave her was a relief, but it was also an insult. It was as if she, Jane Vance, daughter of one of Boston's most prominent families, was not even worth the effort of seduction. The loneliness was a physical ache, sharper than the Boston winters she missed. She had traded a life of intellectual starvation for one of pure, elemental isolation. The tension broke on a Tuesday. Jane was in the general store in Salvation Creek, purchasing flour and beans with the small allowance Silas had left her. The store owner, Mr. Halloway, was a nervous man who never quite met her eye. The batwing doors of the saloon across the street burst open, and a man strode out, followed by two rough-looking ranch hands. The man in the lead was the opposite of Silas. He was of average height, but he moved with a panther-like grace. He wore a fine, tailored waistcoat, a silver-plated revolver on his hip, and a black hat pushed back to reveal a handsome, cruel face. "Well, well," the man purred, his voice carrying across the dusty street. "What have we here?" He crossed the street and stopped directly in front of Jane, blocking her path. He tipped his hat, a gesture that was both polite and predatory. "You must be the new Mrs. Kincaid," he said, his eyes, dark and assessing, raking over her. "The giant's tiny little bride, Barrett Black Bart Hogan, at your service." Jane's blood ran cold. She had heard the name whispered in the store. Hogan owned the saloon, the bank, and most of the land that didn't belong to Silas Kincaid. "Mr. Hogan," she said, her voice tight. She tried to step around him. He moved with her, blocking her again. "In a hurry, little bird. It's a shame. A pretty, delicate thing like you. Wasted on that brute." "My husband is a good man," Jane said, her loyalty surprising even herself. Hogan laughed, a short, barking sound. "Kincaid, a good man. He's a monolith, darling. A big, dumb animal, and a broke one at that." "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, I think you do," Hogan said, leaning in. She could smell whiskey and expensive cigar smoke on his breath. "You're living in that drafty fortress, wondering why your new husband sleeps in a separate room." Jane gasped, her face flushing with heat. How could he know? "This town has no secrets," he whispered. "Especially not from me. Silas Kincaid is a man living on borrowed time. He owes me a great deal of money. That ranch, Kincaid Holdings, it's built on a foundation of debt, and the note comes due in 1 month." He traced a finger along the line of her jaw. Jane flinched but held her ground, refusing to show fear. "When I foreclose," Hogan continued, "he'll have nothing. And you, a smart, beautiful woman. You'll be tied to a pauper. It doesn't have to be that way." "Get your hand off me," she hissed. "I'm offering you a better life, Mrs. Kincaid. A life with a man who appreciates refinement. A man who knows what to do with a woman like you." "And what happens to my husband?" she asked, her voice like ice. Hogan smiled, and it was the most chilling thing she had ever seen. "The prairie is a big place. Men, especially big men, have a habit of disappearing." "Jane." The voice was a tectonic rumble. Both Jane and Hogan turned. Silas Kincaid was standing not 10 feet away, his wagon loaded with fence posts. He hadn't been there a moment before. For a man his size, he moved with a terrifying silence. His face was unreadable, but his hands, clenched at his sides, were white-knuckled. Hogan's smile didn't waver, but his hand dropped from Jane's face. "Silas, just welcoming your lovely bride to Salvation Creek. We were discussing finances." "Get in the wagon, Jane," Silas said, his voice quiet, which was somehow more frightening than a yell. Jane hurried past him, scrambling onto the wagon seat without looking back. Silas turned his full attention to Barrett Hogan. The two men stared at each other for a long, silent moment. The entire street had gone quiet. Even the saloon had fallen silent. "She is my wife, Hogan," Silas said. "For now," Hogan replied, his voice oily. "1 month, Silas. The clock is ticking." Hogan tipped his hat to Jane, a mocking, insolent gesture. "Ma'am." He turned and strode back to the saloon, his two men falling in behind him. Silas Kincaid stood there for a full minute, his back to Jane, his shoulders rising and falling with a controlled, furious breath. Finally, without a word, he climbed up onto the wagon seat. The ride home was even more silent than the first. But this was not an empty silence. It was a silence filled with unspoken danger, with the crushing weight of debt, and with the terrifying reality of what Barrett Hogan had implied. When they got to the ranch, Silas stalked into his study, a room Jane had never entered, and the sound of a bottle being uncorked was followed by a heavy, resounding thud as the door was slammed shut. Jane was left alone in the kitchen, the bag of flour clutched in her hands. Her husband was not just a giant, he was a man in terrible trouble. And in that moment, she realized Barrett Hogan was wrong. She wasn't afraid of Silas Kincaid. She was afraid for him. The confrontation with Hogan shattered the fragile peace of the Kincaid ranch. The house, once just quiet, now felt suffocating. Silas became a phantom, leaving before she woke and returning long after she'd retired to her cold, lonely room. When she did see him, he was grim-faced, his grey eyes stormy and distant. He was carrying a weight that was clearly crushing him, but he would not share it. Her only other human contact was Maeve O'Malley, and the housekeeper's hostility had intensified. Every time Jane entered the kitchen, Maeve would stop humming, her back stiffening. "You," Maeve spat one morning, as Jane tried to help with the dishes. "You're a curse." Jane, whose patience had been worn tissue-thin, finally snapped. "And you, madam, are a delight. What exactly is my crime? That I exist?" "Your crime is him," Maeve said, her voice dropping to a low, venomous hiss. She nodded toward the window, where Silas was visible in the distance, savagely splitting logs with an almost superhuman force. "You've broken him." "I've broken him." Jane was incredulous. "I've done nothing. He barely speaks to me. It's Hogan who is threatening him, not I." "Hogan?" Maeve laughed, a bitter, barking sound. "You think this is about money? You think Hogan just wants this land? You're a fool, girl. You're a naive Boston fool." "Then enlighten me," Jane cried, throwing the dish rag into the sink. "What is this really about? And why do you hate me so? I am Silas's wife. I have a right to know." "Wife?" Maeve scoffed. "You're a piece of paper, a contract. You sleep in your own bed. Don't you dare call yourself his wife." The truth of the words struck Jane like a physical blow. She staggered back, the humiliation burning her cheeks. Maeve's angry expression faltered, a flicker of something, guilt, crossing her features. She turned back to the sink, scrubbing a pot with unnecessary violence. "Just stay out of his way," Maeve muttered, her voice softer. "He has enough to bear without your pale, frightened face reminding him of what he can't have." But Jane's curiosity was now a raging fire. What he can't have. That night, she couldn't sleep. The pacing in Silas's room had returned, louder and more desperate than ever. Thud. 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 She had to know. She had to understand the man she had married. Silas's study was the one place she was forbidden. But tonight, the door was slightly ajar. A sliver of light cut through the dark hallway. She crept toward it, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She heard voices. One was Silas's, low and agonized. "I can't do it, Maeve. I can't lose this place. It's all It's all I have left of her." Maeve's voice finished, sharp and clear. Jane froze. "Her? That's not fair," Silas rumbled. "Isn't it? You brought that girl here, Silas. You brought her into Rose's house." Rose, a first wife. Jane's heart constricted. Of course. A man this lonely. He must be a widower. Maeve wasn't just a housekeeper. She was a loyalist, guarding the memory of the woman Jane had replaced. "I needed a wife," Silas said, his voice flat. The terms of the grant, it requires the land to be. It needs a family. And you thought a piece of paper from Boston would solve it? You thought Hogan wouldn't see right through it? And what about her?" Maeve's voice was laced with a strange, protective venom. "What about Jane? You think she's safe here? You think Hogan doesn't see her as just another piece of property to be claimed? He will not touch her." Silas's voice was a promise of death. "And how will you stop him? You, of all people. You won't even." A heavy glass slammed down on a desk. "Enough!" Silas roared. "It is my burden, Maeve, mine alone." "It's ours, you fool!" Maeve cried, and her voice broke with a sound of pure anguish. "It has always been ours, ever since Father." Father. Jane's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. The study door flew open. Silas filled the doorway, his face a mask of thunder. Behind him, Maeve O'Malley stood, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. Jane was caught. What are you doing?" Silas growled, his eyes dark with suspicion and betrayal. I heard voices," Jane stammered. You called her Maeve, but she called you. She said—" "Father." Maeve stepped forward, her hands clenched. "You weren't meant to hear that." "Maeve O'Malley," Jane whispered, the pieces clicking into place with a sickening lurch. "O'Malley was your mother's name, wasn't it?" Maeve looked at Silas, her expression a mix of terror and defiance. She's not your housekeeper," Jane said, looking at Silas, whose face had gone impossibly, tragically sad. "No," Silas said, his voice a whisper. He stepped aside, revealing the room. It was a simple office, but on the wall, over the fireplace, was a portrait. A portrait of a stern-looking man with Silas's grey eyes standing beside a small, dark-haired woman. Between them, a young, gangly boy with Silas's frame, and a little girl with Maeve's dark, fierce eyes. "Maeve," Silas said, his voice heavy with a lifetime of secrets, "is my sister." Jane stared from Maeve to Silas, and back again. "But why? Why the lies? Why O'Malley? Why pretend to be a housekeeper?" Maeve finally spoke, her voice stripped of its usual anger, leaving only a bone-deep weariness. "Because of Barrett Hogan," she said. "He's not just a rival rancher, girl. He's a blood feud. Our father. He and Hogan's father had a dispute over this very land. Hogan's father died in a hunting accident. Barrett has always believed our father, Alistair Kincaid, murdered him. He has sworn to take everything a Kincaid has, starting with this ranch." "But why you?" Jane asked, still not understanding. "Hogan doesn't know she's my sister," Silas rumbled, stepping back into the room. "She's been gone for years, back east at a school. When she came back, I made her take our mother's name. I made her pose as staff, to protect her." He sank into his desk chair, his massive frame looking defeated. "Hogan, he's a man who collects leverage. If he knew I had a sister, a family member I loved, he would use her against me, just as he is now trying to use you." Jane looked at Maeve, and for the first time, she didn't see a bitter old woman. She saw a young, terrified woman, hiding in plain sight, playing a role to protect her brother. The hostility, It hadn't been for Jane, it had been fear. Fear that Jane would be a weakness. Fear that she would get in the way. And Rose? Jane asked gently. Silas flinched. Maeve looked at the floor. Rose, Maeve said softly, wasn't a first wife. Rose was the name of our mother. The house. This was her house. Silas. He's trying to save our mother's home. Jane looked at the giant of a man, his head in his hands, and her heart, which she had guarded so fiercely, finally broke. He wasn't a monster. He was a son and a brother, trapped by a legacy of debt and violence, trying to protect the only two things he had left, his home and his sister. And now, her. The revelation changed everything. The silence in the house was still present, but it was no longer hostile. It was heavy, weighted with shared secrets. Maeve, no longer needing to play the role of the hostile housekeeper, became a different person. She was still sharp-tongued, but her words were now directed at the problem, not at Jane. "You're moping," she told Silas at breakfast 2 days later. "It's unbecoming. And you," she snapped at Jane, "you're picking at your food. Are you planning to starve yourself? Hogan will be twice as smug if he forecloses on a walking skeleton." For the first time, Jane smiled. "I'll try to eat, Maeve, for the sake of morale." A tiny, almost imperceptible smile touched Maeve's lips. Good, but Silas remained a storm cloud. He was lost in his own dark thoughts, poring over ledgers in his study, the lines of debt and figures a tangible prison. "He's running out of time," Maeve confided in Jane one afternoon as they hung laundry. The wind whipped Jane's hair across her face. "Hogan's note? It's real. And we don't have the money." "What about the cattle?" Jane asked. "We have a good herd, but not enough to cover the whole note. Hogan's been influencing the buyers in Helena. They won't give Silas a fair price. He's trapped. He needs a miracle." Jane looked out at the vast, beautiful, unforgiving land. A miracle seemed in short supply. That night, Jane couldn't sleep. A strange noise had broken the silence. Not Silas's pacing, but something else. A low, pained groan. It was coming from his room. She stood outside his door, her heart hammering. Propriety demanded she return to her room. Concern propelled her forward. She knocked softly. "Silas?" No answer. Just another groan, this one deeper, choked. She turned the knob. The door was unlocked. The room was dark, save for the moonlight streaming through the window. Silas was not in his bed. He was on the floor, on his knees, his massive torso draped over the edge of the mattress, his head buried in his arms. He was shaking. "Silas!" She rushed to his side. "Are you hurt? What is it?" "Get out!" he ground out, his voice thick with pain. "No," she said, her voice firm. "What's wrong? Are you ill?" He tried to push himself up, but his arm buckled. He let out a sharp cry of pain. My leg. The old wound." She looked down. His left leg was stretched out at an awkward angle. She had noticed he had a slight limp, but she assumed it was just part of his size. Now, she saw him grimace and reach for his hip. "It's the weather," he panted, sweat beading on his forehead. "The cold. It seizes up. The doctor in Helena, Josiah Coltrane, he said the metal? Metal. The war," he bit out, as if the words were poison, a piece of shrapnel. "They couldn't get it all. It just burns." Here was the giant of Salvation Creek, the man who Hogan feared, the man who could split logs like twigs, brought to his knees by a piece of metal no bigger than her thumb, and a memory. "Maeve," she called. "No." He grabbed her wrist. His grip was weak, but still strong. "Don't. She worries. She hates seeing me weak." "It's not weakness to be in pain, Silas," Jane said, her voice softening. She gently removed her wrist from his grasp and placed her hand on his massive shoulder. The muscle beneath her palm was knotted and vibrating with tension. "Where is the laudanum?" she asked. "Cabinet. In my study. Bottom shelf." She ran. She found the bottle and a glass and brought it back with a pitcher of water. He was still in the same position, his breathing ragged. She knelt beside him, her fear of him completely, utterly gone. She was looking at a man in agony. "Here," she said, pouring a dose. She held the glass to his lips. He drank, his eyes squeezed shut. His hand, the one not braced on the bed, found her arm, clutching it like a lifeline. He wasn't grabbing her, he was holding on to her. They stayed like that for a long time, the only sound the ticking of the clock and his harsh breathing, which slowly, as the opiate took hold, began to even out. "It's better," he finally slurred, his grip on her arm relaxing. "Good," she whispered. He was still on his knees, but his head now rested on the mattress. Jane sat on the floor beside him. "You should go to bed," he murmured, his eyes closed. "I will," she said. "In a minute." She watched him. This man who was her husband. She saw the lines of pain etched around his mouth, the silver streaks in his dark hair at his temples. She saw the vulnerability he kept hidden from the world, the pain he bore in silence. Without thinking, she reached out and brushed a lock of damp hair from his forehead. His eyes snapped open. They were inches apart. His grey eyes, no longer stormy, but clear and deep and clouded with laudanum, stared into hers. He saw her, really saw her. Not as a contract, not as a replacement, not as a burden, but as the woman who had stayed with him in the dark. "Jane," he breathed. The word was a prayer. He didn't move. He didn't try to kiss her. He just looked at her, his gaze a raw, desperate question. And Jane, the proper Boston lady, the terrified virgin, did something she never thought possible. She leaned forward, and she gently, softly, kissed his rough, stubbled cheek. "Rest, Silas," she whispered. "You are not alone." She helped him to his feet, his massive weight leaning on her, and guided him to his bed. He collapsed onto it, asleep before his head hit the pillow. Jane stood watching him for a moment. The first thaw had come. The ice around her heart had cracked. She went back to her room, but not to sleep. She went to her trunk and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound book. Massachusetts Maritime Law and Contracts, 1855. A gift from her father. Silas was a man of the earth. Hogan was a man of violence. But Jane? Jane was a woman of words, and she was going to find one. The Kincaid ranch house became a war room. The enemy was the date on the calendar. They had 2 weeks. Jane, Maeve, and Silas now ate every meal together, the ledgers spread out on the dining room table. "It's hopeless," Silas said, for the 10th time, rubbing his temples. The pain in his leg had subsided, but the pain of the debt remained. "Hogan has the contracts, our father. He signed them. He borrowed from Hogan's father to build this house, using the land as collateral." "But the land," Maeve insisted, "was a federal grant after the war. It's our land." "The grant is conditional," Silas said, his voice flat. "It required improvements. A house, a stable, a family." He looked at Jane. That's why I sent for a bride. The grant states that if the land is not settled and familial by the 10th year, the claim is forfeit." "When is the 10th year?" Jane asked, her mind racing. 3 days after Hogan's note is due," Silas said, slamming his hand on the table. "It was a trap, from the very beginning. Hogan knew. He let my father borrow, knowing he could seize the land just before the grant became permanent. And when I inherited the trap. So, if you default on the loan, Hogan takes the ranch, Jane summarized, and he gets to keep it because he can pay off the note and install his own family, fulfilling the grant's terms. Exactly. Jane went to her room and returned with her father's heavy law book. Silas looked at it. Jane, with respect, I don't think a Boston law book will help with a Montana land war. Law is law, Silas, Jane said, her voice crisp. A contract is a contract. Let me see the grant and the loan agreement. For 3 days, Jane did not clean. She did not garden. She sat at the desk in the study, surrounded by papers, her face smudged with ink, poring over the fine print. Maeve brought her coffee and sandwiches, which she ate without tasting. Silas would watch her from the doorway, a look of awestruck confusion on his face. He had sent for a wife. He had received a barrister. On the 3rd night, she let out a small cry. Eureka! Maeve and Silas rushed into the study. Jane was standing, her finger pressed to a line of text in the original federal land grant document. Silas, she said, her voice trembling with excitement. You said the grant required a family. What was your father's name? Alistair Kincaid. Why? And your mother's? Rose Kincaid, née O'Malley. And your name? Silas, Jedediah Kincaid. No, Jane said, looking at him. The grant, the application for the grant. Who is listed as the grantee? Silas frowned. My father, Alistair. No, Jane said, pointing. Look, it's not just him. It's a joint application. It's made out to A. Kincaid and Son. Silas leaned in, his eyes widening. And son, me. I was just a boy. And look here, Jane said, her hands shaking as she pulled out the loan agreement from Hogan. Who is the debtor? Who signed the note? My father, Silas said. Only your father, Jane said, her eyes blazing. The loan is with Alistair Kincaid. The land grant, the ownership, is with Alistair Kincaid and Son. Hogan's note, it's only valid against half the property. A slow dawn of understanding broke over Silas's face. Maeve gasped. He can't foreclose, Silas whispered. He can't take the whole ranch. He can't, Jane confirmed. He can take Alistair's share, which, legally, you inherited. But he cannot touch your share, the and son part of the grant. He can't seize the land from a grantee who never signed the loan. He can only take half, Maeve said, confused. He can't even do that, Jane said, pacing. A joint tenancy, which this is, means the property is indivisible without the consent of all parties. He can't break up the ranch. He can't force a sale of your half. His lien, his entire claim, is worthless. Silas sank into a chair. He looked at the paper, then at Jane. He reached out and touched her cheek, his calloused thumb tracing the ink smudge. You saved us, he said, his voice thick. We saved us, Jane corrected, her hand covering his. The moment was broken by a sound from outside, a shout followed by the crack of a rifle. Rustlers! Silas roared, leaping to his feet. He grabbed the Winchester rifle from above the mantel. That's not rustlers, Maeve said, pointing out the window. It's one man, and he's riding. Oh God, Silas, he's riding for the north pasture, towards the old line cabin. A look of pure, unadulterated terror crossed Silas's face. What? Jane asked. What's in the north pasture? Not what? Silas choked out, grabbing his hat. Who? He ran for the door. Hogan. He found out. Found out what? Jane screamed, running after him. My weakness, Silas yelled, already halfway to the barn. It's not just the leg. Maeve grabbed Jane's arm, her face white. It's his condition, the thing that made him. His size? No, Maeve cried. The result of it. He didn't tell you. The doctors, they said he might not be the only one. Silas burst from the barn, not on his horse, but leading a frantic, smaller mule. Jane, Hogan's not after the cattle, he's after him, Maeve shouted. The pieces clicked, the pacing, the pain, the strange reluctance to be seen, the way he favoured his... Wait, Jane said. Josiah Coltrane, the doctor in Helena. You said they. Silas froze, his hand on the mule's rope. He looked at Jane, his face a mask of agony. He's not just a doctor, is he? Jane whispered. No, Maeve said, tears streaming down her face. He's Silas's. He's my son, Silas choked out. My son, Rose. She died giving birth. He has it too. The largeness, the pain. He's deformed, a giant's child. I keep him hidden, with Dr. Coltrane, in the cabin, to protect him. From this. Hogan wasn't going to seize the land. He was going to seize the air. The one thing that proved the familial part of the grant. Silas Kincaid, the giant of Salvation Creek, wasn't a monster. He was a father. Hogan will use him against me, Silas whispered, his voice broken. He'll take my boy. No, Jane said, her voice steel. She ran to the horse trough, grabbed a lit lantern, and smashed it on the dry grass of the hayrick. What are you doing? Maeve shrieked. Creating a diversion, Jane screamed, as the hay went up with a whoosh. Hogan's man is riding for the cabin. He'll see the fire. He'll think the ranch is under attack. He'll come back. She grabbed the rope of the second mule. Maeve, stay here. Put out the edges of the fire, but keep the center burning. Silas, you and I are going to get your son. Silas stared at her. This tiny, 5'4" woman from Boston, who had just set his ranch on fire, her face illuminated by the flames, her eyes blazing with a warrior's light. He was a giant. But she was a titan. All right, he said, swinging onto his horse. Let's go get our boy. The ride to the line cabin was a frantic, desperate blur. The north pasture was a treacherous landscape of rock and shadow, but Silas moved through it with the certainty of a man who had walked it 1,000 times in the dark. Jane, her mule straining to keep up, held on, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and a strange, fierce joy. She was no longer afraid. She was furious. They crested the final ridge. Below them, a small, hidden cabin was nestled in a grove of cottonwoods. A single light burned in the window. But there was a second light. A torch. Hogan's man was already there. They could hear a raised voice. "He's inside!" Silas roared, digging his heels into his horse. He covered the last 100 yards in seconds, leaping from the saddle before the horse had even stopped. He hit the cabin door like a battering ram. The wood splintered, and the door flew open, revealing a scene from a nightmare. Barrett Hogan himself stood in the middle of the room, his silver-plated revolver drawn. In one arm, he held a struggling, terrified boy of about 8 years old. The boy was large for his age, with Silas's grey eyes and a look of pure terror. In the corner, an older man with spectacles, Dr. Josiah Coltrane, lay on the floor, a growing pool of blood soaking his shirt. "Silas!" Hogan sneered, pressing the gun to the boy's head. "So glad you could join us, and you brought the little woman. How familial." "Let him go, Hogan," Silas growled, his hands clenched, his body vibrating with a rage so profound it was almost silent. "Oh, I don't think so," Hogan said, backing toward the door. "This creature. This is my insurance. This is my leverage. The and son on the grant. I take him. I control you." "He's just a boy," Jane screamed from the doorway. "He's a monster!" Hogan spat. "Like his father. And you're a monster lover." "The doctor!" "Silas!" Jane shouted, seeing Dr. Coltrane groan. "He's alive!" Silas was trapped. His son was held hostage, and his friend was bleeding out. He looked at Jane, his eyes a plea. "Hogan," Jane said, stepping into the light of the doorway. She was holding the land grant papers. "You're too late." Hogan laughed. "What's that, little bird? Your marriage certificate? It's worthless." "It's the land grant," Jane said, her voice clear and cold. "The one made out to A. Kincaid and Son, and the loan agreement, made out only to Alistair Kincaid. You have no claim, Barrett." Hogan's smile faltered. What nonsense is this?" "It's law," Jane said. "I'm a shipping magnate's daughter. I know contracts. Your lien is on a dead man's share of an indivisible property. It's worthless. You can't foreclose. You can't seize the land. You can't touch anything." Hogan's face went from smug to confused to enraged. He looked from the papers to Silas. You bitch! You think a piece of paper stops a bullet?" He shoved the boy, Jed, forward and raised the gun, pointing it straight at Silas. "If I can't have the land, no Kincaid will." "No!" Jane screamed. A shot rang out. Silas didn't flinch. He didn't fall. Barrett Hogan stood for a moment, a look of profound surprise on his face. He looked down. A dark stain was spreading across his fine waistcoat. Behind him, in the doorway, stood Maeve O'Malley, a smoking rifle in her hands. "The fire was a good idea," Maeve panted. "But I thought you might need a better one." Hogan collapsed. The silence in the cabin was broken by the boy, Jed, who ran straight into Silas's arms. Father! Father!" Silas wrapped his massive arms around his son, burying his face in the boy's hair, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "I'm here, Jed. I'm here. You're safe." Jane rushed to Dr. Coltrane. "He's been shot in the shoulder. It's bad, but I think he'll live." "He's tough," Maeve said, lowering the rifle, her hands shaking. Silas finally looked up, his eyes finding Jane's across the room. He was still clutching his son, the physical, living proof of his greatest secret and his greatest love. "Jane," he started. She crossed the room. She didn't stop at Silas. She knelt in front of the boy, Jed, who peered at her with wide, fearful grey eyes. "Hello, Jedediah," Jane said softly, her voice breaking. "I'm Jane. I'm your father's wife, which means I'm your new mother." The boy looked at his father, who nodded, his face wet with tears. Jed slowly, hesitantly, reached out a hand. Jane took it. Silas knelt, wincing from the pain in his leg, until the three of them were on the same level. He put one giant, scarred hand over Jane's, and the other on his son's shoulder. They were a triangle, a family. "The loan," Silas whispered. "Hogan, was he?" "He was right about the note," Jane said, not looking away from Jed. "But he was wrong about the law." She looked at Silas, her eyes shining. "You are not a monster. You are a father and a husband." The ride back to the ranch was a procession. Silas rode, his son in the saddle in front of him. Jane rode beside them, while Maeve and the wounded Dr. Coltrane followed on the mule. When they arrived at the ranch house, the sun was rising. The hayrick was a smouldering ruin. But the house was fine. That night, after Jed was asleep in what used to be Jane's room, and Dr. Coltrane was bandaged and resting, Jane found Silas on the porch. He was staring at the mountains, a small, worn photograph in his hand. It was of a pretty, dark-haired woman. "Rose," Jane said, standing beside him. He nodded. Jed's mother. She was a saloon girl. died, I couldn't bear to have him shamed. I couldn't let him be a giant's bastard. So I hid him. You protected him, Jane corrected. He turned to her. The moonlight hit his scarred, harsh face, and for the first time Jane saw him as he truly was. Not a giant, not a brute, just Silas. I sent for a wife, he said, his voice raw. A contract. I never expected you. And I answered for a new life, she said, her voice soft. I was afraid of everything. That first night, he murmured. You asked me to go slow. Just the tip, you said. Jane blushed, but she met his gaze. I was terrified of this house, of this land, of you. And now? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Jane stepped closer. She stood on her tiptoes and placed her hands on his massive chest. She could feel his heart, a strong, steady beat beneath her palms. Now, she said, I think I am finally ready for the full length. She wasn't talking about the physical act. Not entirely. She was talking about the full, terrifying, beautiful, painful, and magnificent life he offered. The full man. His past, his pain, his secrets, his son. Silas looked down at her. This small, brave woman who had set fire to his ranch and saved his son, and his heart, which had been frozen for a decade, finally broke open. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of gratitude, of desperation, of a decade of loneliness, and the promise of a lifetime. It was the kiss of a man who had been saved. And Jane, his wife, his partner, his barrister, she kissed him back, taking all of it, the giant and the man, and holding on as if she never, ever intended to let go. And so, the mail-order bride who came to Salvation Creek, seeking refuge, found more than a home. She found a family, and a love as vast and wild as the Montana plains. Silas, the man who thought his size made him a monster, learned that true strength wasn't in his fists, but in the giant, vulnerable heart his wife was brave enough to claim. Their story teaches us that what we fear, what we hide, and what we think we want are often just shadows. The real life story begins when we're brave enough to face the full truth and the full heart of another. Thank you for listening to this dramatic story. If you were on the edge of your seat, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel. What part of Jane and Silas's story was your favorite? The wedding night twist? The reveal of Jed? Let me know in the comments below. And for more stories of wild hearts and dramatic twists, make sure you subscribe and ring that notification bell. You won't want to miss what's coming next.